So my name is Edna Wangoi from Geography. That's probably where I should have started. And I'm from Kenya, but I love living in Athens, not when it's too cold, but for the most part. And my goal today is to introduce Dr. Perkins to you. Dr. Perkins is an associate professor in geography, one of my colleagues. We actually started here the same year, which was in 2006. He earned his PhD from University of Wisconsin at Milwaukee that same year, 2006. He publishes on political ecology and economy of environments, and some of his topics, the topics that he covers in his publications include neoliberalization, the state, governance, environmental justice, which is one of the central topics that he'll be covering today, and the agency of non-human organisms. So please join me in welcoming Dr. Perkins.
Okay, thanks everybody. If you can't hear me in the back, let me know. It's great to be here. Thanks for taking some of your afternoon to come and listen to me talk. I would just like to say, first of all, a big thank you to Drs. Wangui and Kim for their Herculean efforts in putting together the wealth and poverty theme and the certificate and all of these great talks. And it's indeed an honor to be asked to come talk in front of you today. Yes, so I have a very long title to my presentation. This picture is a little bit washed out. I apologize for that, but it's a panorama of the well field, the water well field that services the people that get their water from the Little Hocking Water Association, right? Little Hocking being about, 30, 40 miles, pretty much east of here. And it's hard to see, but this looks like a big grassy field with a few wellheads on it. But what's important is across the Ohio River is a bunch of stacks, a bunch of smokestacks, sort of towering industrial buildings. And those buildings are literally just, yards away from this well field. And those stacks and some other landfills associated with that facility are what emitted this contaminant that I want to talk about today into these people's water. Okay, so what is environmental justice, right? There are a lot of different definitions of environmental justice, and I don't want to spend a ton of time going through all of them. But broadly speaking, I'm going to define that today as both a social movement and a field of study that addresses inequitable distributions of health risks, right? From exposure to pollution and other environmental hazards, noxious land uses, right? Those kinds of things. Environmental justice, unlike the mainstream environmental movement, like we would think about like Sierra Club or Nature Conservancy or something like that, right? Environmental justice organizations tend to be small-scale, community-level, grassroots kind of reactions to noxious land uses, right? A community in south central Los Angeles, for example, being very concerned about the siting of a garbage incinerator in their neighborhood, right? A rural African-American community in North Carolina being concerned about a proposed PCB landfill. These movements tend to be small-scale reactions to certain events, certain polluting or pollution events in their local environment. And so it's only, I would say, a bit more recently that we've started to see a lot more environmental justice work coming out of the Appalachia region, right? People starting to work on environmental justice, including some of the faculty that we have here on campus, right? So it's important to consider what we can learn from what's going on in Appalachia through an environmental justice perspective and to understand what's happening in terms of activism as well, right? So the typical story, right, of Appalachia is that it's a resource-rich part of the world, right? But at the same time, it's paradoxically socioeconomically marginalized. It's politically marginalized. That's well documented. That's been documented for a long time, right? Appalachia is a region of boom and bust extraction where outsiders profit and leave behind economic, environmental, and social dysfunction in their wake. What I think is sort of interesting is that increasingly in the environmental justice literature and even the environmental justice literature addressing issues in Appalachia, we're seeing more of the use of the term sacrifice zone, right? That in fact the environment, the quality of the environment public health, the health of individual bodies, is sacrificed, right? We're describing these zones as spaces, places, or regions where environmental quality is sacrificed, right, for the extraction of resources, the generation of wealth, largely to benefit people that are living outside of the region, okay? But what is important, right, is that this is not a monolithic region. As geographers are, very adamant that we need to consider how regions are subjected, their subjective social constructions, that we have to understand Appalachia rather as one, instead of one monolithic region, we can describe it as a varied group of environmental justice communities that face all sorts of different challenges, right? Coal mining, logging, fracking, and chemical manufacturing as well. And that's what I'm going to focus on today, right, is the chemical manufacturing aspect of what's going on in central Appalachia. So let's drill down and look at an even finer scale of analysis, right? I want to focus on what's going on over there in the Ohio River, right, along the Ohio River, just east of here, in what is known as West Virginia's Polymer Alliance Zone. These three counties right across from Little Hocking are counties the state has designated as a place, right, sort of a special economic zone conducive to the production of all sorts of chemicals that are useful in making plastics and all sorts of other things for our consumer paradise, right? So this is, in these three counties, one of the largest concentrations of production facilities for polymers anywhere in the world, which is pretty amazing, right? But I'm going to focus in on one particular plant, right? And that's the DuPont Washington Works plant that has long either used or made C8 as a part of its larger production process. What's important to note now is that since this work has been completed, DuPont renamed the facility Chemours. And interestingly enough, if you know anything about what's going on as well, DuPont is merging with Dow Chemical, right? So there are all these kinds of things going on right now. So it remains to sort of be seen how this plays out with this particular facility. But I'm talking primarily about the Washington Works plant. That was that collection of stacks, right, that I showed you in the first picture by the well field. And so I'll probably refer to this mostly as DuPont, even though its name has changed. When this work was completed, we're talking about DuPont. And as Callie Lyons, the C8 activist, environmental justice activist who wrote a book, has written in her book, thanks to the Washington Works plant right over here, the people living in this area are now the most C8 contaminated people on the planet. Interestingly enough, if you grew up anywhere in the United States or in the developed world, you could, get your blood tested and you would also have this compound in your body, right? Because it's a ubiquitous product used in a whole bunch of, or chemical used in a whole bunch of different consumer products. So C8 is short for perfluorooctanoic acid. Don't worry, I will not make you recite that to me at the end of this project, right? I'm not a chemist, but my understanding is this is a very stable chain of 8 fluorine atoms bonded to one another. So what that means is that it persists in the environment for a very long time. It takes it a long time to degrade in the environment, and it also takes it a very long time to degrade in your body, which is important as well, okay? It's been used to make non-stick cookware. How many of you have Teflon at home or have cooked on Teflon, right? Ubiquitous consumer product. You have to have, or at least in the past, I should say, manufacturers had to have C8 to help make that non-stick coating. It's common in waterproof rain gear. It's common in pizza containers, French fry boxes, all sorts of different things that you don't want that paper product to break down because of the water and grease in food, right? So because this stuff is so ubiquitous, we all have some level of this stuff in our blood. And at least up until quite recently, this has not been a regulated chemical, right? What's interesting, as I'll talk about in a minute, DuPont and other companies like 3M have known for decades that this stuff is bad for us, but they didn't take it out of production because it's been such an advantageous chemical to use, okay? It is classified as a probable carcinogen, right? Meaning that it has it's very likely to cause cancer. Okay, so a very long story, and perhaps maybe some of you read that New York Times article that I forwarded on to Dr. Kim. There's a really good sort of, investigative journalism going into just how much DuPont knew about this chemical how long ago, right? And this thing was created, this chain of fluorine atoms was created sometime in the 1940s or 50s, and scientists realized that it would be really useful to use this stuff in production, particularly in the 1960s onward. And companies like 3M and even DuPont did their own internal studies that suggested that animals exposed to this stuff would get cancer, that it caused birth defects, right? So it's a possible, or at least a known teratogen based on some of the internal studies that these companies conducted. 3M in the 1990s decided that C8 was too much of a liability, and they pulled it out of production. And DuPont used to get it from 3M. And so when 3M said no more, DuPont decided to make it at their plant, even though they knew it was bad for people, and they knew that it was escaping into the environment. Okay? It was going out the stacks, and they were also burying large quantities of this stuff in landfills in and around their property by Washington Works plan. They knew that they had an issue with it. There are internal memos from their attorneys when they realized that they had a problem, right? DuPont actually sent its own researchers out into the communities around the plant and took water samples from various homes and businesses so they could test to see how much of their C8 was actually in the water. And so they had a really good indication they had a plume of this stuff in the water table that they had to deal with at some point. But the company elected to continue. They doubled down, essentially. They elected to continue using more of this stuff in the production process because they knew they were going to get sued eventually, and they wanted to make as much money as they could from it before they had to actually pay up. I mean, this is stuff that's documented in memos between attorneys. Pretty depressing kinds of things. So it's getting into the air through the stacks, and it's precipitating out. This is a really bad map. I apologize. Washington Works facility, Ohio River, well field is just right there. So some of it's going up the stacks and then raining back down from the clouds, but then a bunch of it is also entering the ground from a couple of different landfills, one of which was on site, and then another one that Washington Works and DuPont later on bought with the express purpose of burying this stuff. So we've got it coming into the environment from a bunch of different mechanisms, okay? But what this did, right, was severely contaminate well water from a number of communities adjacent to this facility. The most contaminated, or the highest readings coming from public water, though, were coming from the Little Hocking well field that I showed you that picture of. They have since closed a couple of those wells because they're so badly contaminated. So, as people began to realize what was going on, right, a local farmer hired an attorney who sued DuPont for all these records that I've been telling you about. It became apparent that there was a very big problem with the release of this material. Right? Testing occurred in all of these different public supplies, which then caused these public water utilities and other individuals to engage in litigation with DuPont to force them to do something about this. Right? So a couple of things happened from some of the original litigation. A study was ordered that would take the blood from what turned out to be 69,000 people, right? The largest blood serum study, or human serum study in the world up to that point, okay? So we get blood from all these people, test it to see how much of the C8 is in their blood, and then try to link statistically that material in their bodies to other diseases. And the results of that C8 science panel determined that, yes, kidney diseases are statistically linked, as well as other cancers. There's a host of cancers that are also a part of that. As a part of that original litigation, DuPont was ordered to put filters on public water supplies as well. Right? So Little Hocking has a big building now where their water is intercepted in the pipes and it goes through activated charcoal, right? Granular charcoal to filter this stuff out. And so that's something that has to happen into perpetuity, right? Because there's so much of this chemical in the ground. It has to happen from here into eternity, right? There are also now 3,500 individual lawsuits that have been foisted on DuPont based on this contamination. People saying, look, I have this disease, I drank this water, therefore, I want compensation. And so literally there are hundreds of millions of dollars at stake going forward. DuPont has already spent $100 million or more, but it's going to spend even more if these lawsuits are successful, and the first one already has been successful. Okay, so the evidence is there. We know that this company acted nefariously. It acted in pretty bad faith, right, trying to kind of cover up or hide all of the things that it was emitting for all of these years, okay? But what I found was really interesting is that there wasn't the seemingly sort of vocal, upfront kind of protest that you would read about in other kinds of environmental justice communities that have had arguably much less exposure to contamination than this one. Right? There are a bunch of textbook examples of PCB landfills in places like Warren County, North Carolina, or even Love Canal, right, in upstate New York, that got a lot of press. There are a lot of people actively protesting about that. And I'm like, where is this? Why is this not happening in Little Hocking? Or at least I wasn't finding it, right? So one of the things that I did with supervising a grad student is we sent her out to ask people in this community what they think about what happened. Because people were conducting blood serum tests, right? They were doing all sorts of statistical analysis, but no one was really asking the people living there, what do you think about this event? How did this affect you, right? Do you consider this as an environmental injustice? So that was the really big question that we wanted to ask. Do you actually consider this to be an injustice, right? To try and get at this issue of why do we not seem to see or find more people up in arms about this, right? Protesting or something like that. So for the remainder of the talk, what I want to do, right, is demonstrate or show that many residents that live in Little Hocking, right, benefit from various forms of privilege based on their association with DuPont. Okay? And that's really important because if they have certain kinds of privileges associated with this company, they're going to work to defend it against economic uncertainty, right? The plight of unemployment, a lack of economic diversity in the region. And so I want to demonstrate how the maintenance or the defense of that privilege explains why Little Hocking is an EJ community from a textbook standpoint. It meets, sort of all the criteria, right? But it doesn't seem to identify itself as such, right? Or at least we saw like really mixed results with regard to that self-identification, right? So also I want to reveal how the defense of privilege at the local scale, what's going on in and around Little Hocking, right, has the potential to enhance exploitation occurring at that same local scale, right, while enhancing extra local forms of privilege and power. So then I think in conclusion, what we're going to have to do is acknowledge that EJ activists in largely white working class communities are going to have to overcome that challenge associated with defending privilege, which by extension defends the contaminated status quo. With me so far? Okay. So let's talk about race, class, and environmental justice in Appalachia very quickly, right? Environmental justice as an activist movement or set of movements has its origins in the civil rights era, right? A lot of the people that were working to fight, or fighting for civil rights are the same kinds of people that helped to sort of get this environmental awareness, right, and this justice activism in the environmental arena going, right? So in the 1980s, we see the civil rights leaders working with anti-toxic activists like in places like Warren County, North Carolina. There are all sorts of different examples that I could give you with this today. Since then, right, geographers, oh my goodness, we like to use all of our spatial analytical tools at our disposal to try and understand, right, the spatiality of toxics and race and class, right? Lots of studies have connected minority standing with proximity to toxics, right? Some of the very earliest studies that were done in environmental justice can tell us, okay, if you think about, you want to know where you have toxic landfills, right? All you need to do is look at the actual racial composition of communities to understand statistically where they're most likely to be, right? And as a part of this, we have this emergence of thinking about environmental racism, right? That there are ways that racism can actually permeate the way that we manage environments, okay? Particularly in relation to how certain groups of people are exposed to toxins in the environment based on the color of their skin, right? And so some people talking about or writing about EJ have likened this issue, or at least linked this issue of environmental racism to the notion of white privilege, okay? And white privilege, at least as defined in part by Laura Polito, refers to the enhanced social, economic, and political standing of white people relative to those people of color, okay? And essentially what we're talking about, to sort of boil it down here, right, is better educational opportunities, access to the labor market, right? What kind of jobs are available and who gets them, housing, right, and access to political power as well, right? That's a really important aspect of this. And the argument that is made here is that whites are often able to deflect disamenities, right, away from their communities. And that means that they oftentimes land in communities of color, particularly when we're talking about what's going on in urban areas or cities. But you're probably asking yourself, well, how does this apply to Appalachia, right? Because we think of Appalachia as putatively race-free. Seems like everybody's white, right? But again, Appalachia's a big place, okay? Certain parts of it, there are lots of minorities living, but we are going to focus on central Appalachia. And so if you look at central Appalachia as a whole, its racial component could be upwards of 95% white. So there is this, well, why are we talking about white privilege and trying to link that to EJ if we're talking about mostly a white population? What's going on here, right? But what I would argue is that we need to consider additional dimensions of privilege, right? Other people have made this argument as well, that class, right? Class standing is very important as well. It's another factor that the poor often have a difficult time deflecting pollution away from their neighborhood, right, or away from their locality. And so we have to think about how that relates. White Appalachians seem to reap the benefits of their race in terms of their region in albeit limited ways, right? They are the predominant players in the workforce and the educational system, so on and so forth. So in a sense, white privilege still exists in Appalachia, and certain scholars have already argued that, right? We also know there's a great deal of racism within Appalachia, particularly from white communities towards communities of color. But we have to sort of drill down, I think, a little bit further to understand this notion of privilege, to extend the notion of privilege to consider how it varies intra-racially within the same racial group, right? That's really important. As people like Smith have noted, the exploitation of white Appalachians is common as they're excluded from powerful forms of privilege that are operated by white people living outside of their region, right? The idea that Appalachia is an economic engine that's, created a lot of wealth for people that live on the East Coast, for example, something like that, right? That in fact, the sort of hardships or the externalized costs, right, of our capitalist productive system has been foisted on white Appalachians to the benefit of wealthier people living outside of Appalachia, right? So we see all these different environmental harms based on mountaintop removal, right? The legacy of coal mining, logging, pick your industry. It's caused damage and that wealth has gone elsewhere. It's left the region, more or less. So we have to be very careful and consider intraracial class antagonisms as those will construct a certain form of white other, right? A process of othering whereby some scholars have said that Appalachians are not white enough, or they're not quite white enough, or something like that, right? That there are intraracial discrepancies. And we have to be careful, right? Because this intraracial class antagonism makes it really easy to blame individual white Appalachians for their impoverished standing. Well, they're white, they should be doing better. What's going on here, right? That kind of thing. Well, we ignore these larger structural processes operating in society that marginalize an entire group of people. And so, of course, this is well documented. This leads to economically and politically stunted societies that often sort of paradoxically will defend the very corporations that are polluting them, that are contaminating their environment. Okay, quick methodology. What do? Interview 20 stakeholders in Little Hocking, Ohio, people that have been exposed to this stuff long term, okay? Long-time residents, most were parents. We interviewed as a part of that cohort a local EJ activist and author. We talked to the Ohio EPA and US EPA officials as well, and we asked them questions related to perceptions of economic well-being, corporate power, right, their perception of DuPont, their notions of sacrifice, their willingness to sacrifice, and then also this issue of environmental justice, right? That was kind of the big question at the end. Well, do you think this is an environmental injustice foisted upon you? Also attended one of the 3 C8 science panels. My grad student did that, held for the public to get an idea of the public's anxiety and questions for the C8 science panel. That was very interesting. And then conducting analysis of dozens of different documents, including newspapers. There are all sorts of documents by the C8 science panel on its website with relevant health studies. We looked at weblogs, court cases, and materials provided by the Little Hocking Water Association, Ohio Environmental Protection Agency, and the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. Okay, so what did we find? only 1/3 of our interviewees considered C8 contamination to be an environmental injustice. And I have to admit I was a bit surprised. Some people were like, yeah, why are you surprised about that? But I found that to be surprising. And so one of the things that I want to do is read you some of the quotes from the people that we talked to. And some of the people that consider this an injustice said, quote, DuPont refused for decades to tell us what they were dumping, and there's still stuff they're not telling us they're dumping. So, okay, what's the other chemicals that are in there and they're not even telling us? And I have a couple more that I want to talk to you about as well here, if I can find them. Another interviewee said, quote, my suspicion is DuPont has known C8 has been there for a long, long time and just didn't tell anybody, and I wonder if it didn't get brought to everyone else's attention and got in the media if they would still not have told us. That's the part that frustrates me. If DuPont knew about it for 20 or 30 years and they didn't tell anybody, then that's definitely a social injustice. If they knew that that was the material and put it in there, knowing it was going to migrate in people's wells, that's an environmental injustice to me. What's interesting, too, is that this group of people had more family and friends that were sick. They didn't know for sure whether or not it was caused by this stuff, but they had more people that were ill in their family or had passed away, and they were very concerned about the potential connection there. What was maybe even more interesting, I guess, is that another third of the interviewees didn't consider it to be an injustice at all, right? What DuPont had perpetuated wasn't an issue to them. At least that's what they told us, right? And then the remaining third were really ambivalent, like, I don't know. And we found that to be really interesting. One thing that was interesting about this group is they had closer connections to the facility. Everybody we interviewed had a family member or a friend who worked at DuPont. But these people tended to have a closer connection to the facility, and they denied knowing anyone who was sick, right? So they didn't, at least to us, didn't convey that information. And so one of these people that was against considering it an injustice said, quote, I don't know that it's an injustice per se. DuPont needs to be here too, right, which was rather interesting. Another person said, you want to have a job, especially in our area. I know maybe people can get sick from C8, but this country is going to shrivel up if we don't have industry, okay? Another one, it's hard to say that it's an injustice because you can't shut down every steel mill, every chemical plant. It just doesn't work, and that's just not the way this country was brought up. And we'll have less now than we did then because a lot of the stuff is made over in China and in different countries. We don't have the industrial era like we did back in the 1940s and 1950s, especially after World War II. So this is important. There's sort of an anxiety going on, and it makes sense. DuPont's website, right, claimed in 2014 that it employs 1,800 people, an additional 400 independent contractors, 450, excuse me, a payroll of $134 million, and it claims it pays 7.5% of the Wood County tax. So, also with thousands of spin-off jobs, who else in this region can make those kinds of economic claims? That's really powerful stuff, right? But what we found in talking with these people is that their narrative, right, their line of reasoning was more than just jobs. It encompassed a whole lot more, right? Our interviewees lamented, right, the possibility of losing a standard of living associated with the American dream, right? They were kind of going back to this idea of the American dream through employment. So some of the responses that we got from these individuals, quote, they built all these plants. Guys went to work making good money. They all had a home and raised kids. We had a nice lifestyle. We had plenty of money and food to put on the table. We could take vacations. We had a car to run all the kids. And so we thought we were eating high off the hog. Another person said, DuPont was a big deal then. Everybody wanted to graduate from high school and get a good job at DuPont. DuPont was a great asset, and it was because you could get a good job, and then at that time there was job security. It provided homes, food on the table, 2 cars in the driveway, a camper, and vacations, right? And another person actually told us, look, this company pays taxes, right, that support our school systems. They went on to say, they're not just a taker, referring to DuPont. They give back to the community. And DuPont also owns historic Blennerhassett Island, which they lease to the state of West Virginia for $1 a year for use as a state park. Right? So these people are talking about all the different things that this company's existence does for them, right? The positive things in their life that to them justifies having this company around, okay? And that's important, right? Working for DuPont provides a substantial set of privileges that are relatively rare in this region, right? It's not just about the money, it's just not about the employment, it's about all the other things that you can do, all the different ways you can fit in and function in American consumer society that goes along with that, right? There's a privilege of working, certainly, but also consuming at that middle class level, better schools, all this kind of stuff, right? The fear is that this will be lost if people openly criticize this company, okay? That's important. People recognize these kinds of jobs are uncommon in Appalachia, and making a move to find employment elsewhere, if the company shutters, is really unlikely for a lot of these people, right? Another person defending DuPont said, unfortunately, jobs are what determines a lot of times where you live. You have to have a job somewhere else before you can just get in a car and drive somewhere and park in a parking lot and say, okay, well, now what am I going to do? And a lot of times I've had friends or people say, well, why don't you just move away from here? Well, yeah, but we don't because it's because of those reasons. Where are you going to go, right? So this person is saying, look, our options are limited, and this is what we have. So I think we have to acknowledge the complexity of privilege, right? As white Appalachians are, in a sense, privileged because they're white, but also considering the fact that they lack the power to actually call this company out on its actions, right? They lack the power to deflect polluting practices from their community. So yes, they cling to a set of privileges that you or I probably appreciate, living somewhere that's not polluted, but they're unable to deflect the really high cost of that in terms of pollution based on their limited economic prospects. So it's interesting to me, right? Because Little Hawking seems to be a textbook case study of an environmental justice community, right? It has received some attention as of late in major media outlets. But when you talk to people in this particular community, remember, these people have been drinking this stuff for decades now. And there doesn't seem to be consensus about this being an environmental justice community at all, okay? And some of the people that considered contamination to be an injustice said, quote, they do supply some people with really great jobs, but I think those people are prepared to be sick and even die because of the jobs they have. There are DuPonters and there are families who are fine with that because DuPont has given them everything they have. And another person said, I think men accept to sacrifice themselves for work. It's kind of the coal miner mentality. It might make you sick, but you're providing for your family. And yet another person said, first off, I don't think anybody's job should cost them their life or their health or their family's health. What they're doing is affecting the whole community, and we're not getting a paycheck for it. What they do is start that rally cry for jobs, but I don't owe them my life. I don't owe them that for their jobs. I didn't make that agreement to work there. So that's definitely someone who considered this contamination to be an unjust act. Right, but what's interesting is that the people that defended DuPont in our interviews didn't believe they had gotten sick from exposure. They didn't believe that any of their family or friends had gotten sick either. So that's a really, I think, important point there. Defending DuPont is made easier through substantial uncertainty around the link between contamination and disease and death, right? The people that considered it an injustice said, look, we think this is an injustice because we don't know how this is going to impact us, but it has the real potential to be negative. Whereas the people that defended DuPont said, look, we don't know. They said basically the same thing, but since there isn't really any evidence in my body or in my family, why is this a big deal, right? This is despite the fact that, well, I should say when we were interviewing, so the C8 science panel results, some of them were not out yet. Okay. And then this uncertainty, another person said, who was considering this an injustice, said with regard to uncertainty, quote, what do you compare our C8 exposures to, is the question. We've all drank this stuff all of our whole lives, so we don't have anything else to compare it to. Every time somebody gets cancer, you think back about people that have died. You start wondering why it happened. Is something in the air? Is something in the water? Is it something genetic? Or why is the cancer rate what it is here? Right? So there's a substantial amount of uncertainty that makes people really quite worried about that. But But at the same time, right, this uncertainty can be mobilized to excuse corporate malfeasance, right, from people saying, personally, I've been drinking it a lot for a long time, and I don't see any effects, so I don't think it's an injustice. Another interesting thing is that some of our people that were sort of ambivalent, right, that were apologists for DuPont's actions, said, look, you know, they probably shouldn't have done what they did, but at the same time, they're doing right by us now, right? They put in that activated charcoal filter, right? The carbon filters on the public water supplies. They provided bottled water initially. They've put all this money into these health studies, the serum studies, so they're doing the right thing. What's interesting to me, though, is these people didn't seem to acknowledge the fact that DuPont was doing this every step of the way by court order, right? They were legally mandated to do this, okay? Some of these people, though, felt that Little Hawking was fortunate that DuPont acts responsibly, and it was interesting in their comments they were telling us, as opposed to these companies out there beyond Southeast Ohio and West Virginia that treat their residents really badly. But we didn't get firm examples of what those nefarious companies that are worse than DuPont were. They never gave us that specificity. They just said, look, we think our company's doing well by us now, and we're going to stick by our company as well, okay? So that makes this idea of Little Hawking as a self-described EJ community really problematic. So let's talk a little bit about privilege, local scale exploitation, and the link between extra-local power. One thing that's really interesting is the people that defended DuPont's actions suggested that the global benefits of all of the products produced by DuPont greatly outweigh the harms, right? That in fact it's justified in polluting people. However, right, local pollution really, if we think about it, is about externalizing the costs of production onto a certain group of people, right? And in doing so, that helps corporate entities accumulate wealth and power elsewhere. DuPont's headquarters is somewhere over there in Delaware, right? Washington Works is one dot on this multinational company's very large global map. If you go visit their website, they've got facilities everywhere, all over the world, okay? So we have to understand how creating all of these really cheap consumer products is made possible only when we don't take care of the environment, we don't take care of people living in the community around our plant, right? We're externalizing the cost of dealing with that pollution onto people and the environment, right? So actually we have a severe imbalance of power between the community that can't say stop it, right? And a very large corporation that can afford to hire lawyers, bide its time, so on and so forth. One person said, and I thought this was a really great quote, I think people for the last 40 or 50 years now have thought about DuPont as a local business, and it's not. It's a major, major worldwide corporation. Another person said, DuPont executives are not even in this area, so the concern is not as great to them probably. It's their reputation. It's not their health that they're worried about. And of course they're going to say that the welfare of our area is first and foremost. It's easy to say words, but if they were living here, maybe their view would be even a little more intense because they were having to drink the water and breathe the air. They may be a little more concerned about it than maybe just sitting in an office somewhere. But the bigger the company like that, the less decisions are made by people that are actually over here. So this creates a real conundrum, I think, for communities like Little Hawking, right? I think that there's a situation going on here that the more that residents defend corporate malfeasance, the nefarious actions of companies, right, in the interest of preserving their own set of privileges, right, the more power they give to the corporation to continue holding sway over them or threatening their interests, right? If everyone's going to play that kind of game, then companies can kind of do whatever they want in the process. What's interesting, right, also is that DuPont fosters a family mentality among its workers and supporters, that they're all in this together, that it's in essence a family company looking out for all of its family members, okay? And that's a really powerful sort of narrative that this company has created, right? But I don't think that's probably the case. I think that it doesn't take much investigation to realize that there are very large discrepancies or inequities in the amount of power that family members hold, right, in this particular company. The threat of corporate mobility acts to discipline, right? Dissidents. People will not speak out. The people that were afraid to speak out, right, are worried about doing so because they're afraid they'll lose their job, their friend will lose their job, they'll lose their pension, so on and so forth, right? The privileges of being in a white working class community will be lost entirely if the company leaves, right? What are the prospects for people if this goes away? And what's really interesting, too, is it seems like residents can't depend on their regulators to make things right, okay? We still really haven't gotten C8 regulated as it probably should be. Some of our interviewees that consider this an injustice were really concerned about the West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection. We had more than one person telling us that this agency does not do a very good job, okay? In fact, one of our interviewees talked about how one of the officials that was supposed to be overseeing documents about C8 exposure levels was actually caught shredding documents to protect DuPont from legal liability. Now that was her story, okay? Okay, let me get to my other quote here. I can't do that with water in my hand. All right, so another quote. This goes to this issue of regulatory capture that's really important. The West Virginia Department of Environmental Protection adjusted the safe levels of POFA increasingly higher, seemingly from the community's perspective, to remain above the highest level detected in Little Hocking Water's wells. Following measurement of POFA in Little Hocking's wells up to 78 parts per billion, the state of West Virginia pronounced a safe level at 150 parts per billion, far above the historic internal community exposure guideline of 1 part per billion in water used by the fluoropolymer facility in 1991, referring to DuPont. So every time they discovered there was more of this stuff in the water, they upped the safe threshold above that, right? Meanwhile, there is very little information circulating in the public for how safe this stuff really is. And so people are concerned about that. In regard to the Ohio EPA and the US EPA, some of our people that considered this, our response that considered this an injustice, said the EPA isn't looking at a solution that's permanent. It's not cleanup. It's just filtering. I don't know if true cleanup is possible, but it's not talked about. And another one of our interviewees said, to me, that filter is just like putting a Band-Aid on a hemorrhage, right? So there's a lot of discontent that this is not a permanent solution. What happens if the company goes away? Where does the water come from to keep putting that charcoal in the system, in the filter, right? It has to be changed out like once a week, and it's very expensive. This is hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. So what do we do? People are worried about that. Some of our people are worried about that. So in conclusion, activists in white working class communities must challenge the notions of privilege that defend the contaminated status quo. But the fight isn't fair, right? That's what's so challenging about this. Fitting in the Little Hocking community hinges on participating in a set of relationships that are akin to living in conservative middle America. You don't cause a lot of waves in these kinds of communities, right? Because people are afraid for their economic well-being. But what's interesting, it's pretty clear from some of our respondents, is that the social fabric of the community is somewhat torn. At least it's very torn for certain people that have been vocal about their concerns over what this company has done, as some of our respondents were telling us about how they had been, confronted by people who said, stop being vocal about this particular company, you are risking our welfare. Some people had been threatened physically. They claimed they had been threatened physically. Some people had to change churches a couple of times, right? So all these kinds of issues that people were sort of expelled from this community based on their activism. So unfortunately, solidarity is lacking here, right? As Appalachians are pitted against Appalachians, rather than forming coalitions, right, against industry and captured regulators. And I want to be clear, too, that I don't think this is some sort of Marxist false consciousness of the proletariat kind of situation where these workers don't understand what they're being subjected to. I think the case is actually far from that, right? Our respondents seem to suggest that they understand and acknowledge, and the workers in this plant accept and acknowledge the risk that these poisons provide them, but they're willing to take it, right, in exchange for all of the things that we've been talking about that are associated with this sort of working/middle class standard of living. And so, I would argue that Appalachia needs more direct intervention. Of course, we have the Appalachian Regional Commission. We have the Appalachian Redevelopment Act, was it 1965? We have development aid coming into this region, but it's been happening for a very long time. And it's not enough. We don't have enough to overcome a democratically stunted situation, I think, in a lot of communities. And so one of the things that I argue out of this is that we need larger incentives, right, to diversify a much more sustainable economy. And I know sustainability means a whole bunch of different things, but we have to give people options. We have to give people economic options that don't poison them, that don't give them cancer, that don't give them birth defects, right? So we need diversified, sustainable economic development. And the hope here is that that would lessen the public's fear of speaking out against the big polluters, right? The worst of the worst. If I have more economic options and I can walk from this place and I can go work at this place that treats its employees better and does better by the environment, maybe people are more likely to call out polluters in their community as power is diffused among not just a handful of corporations in the state, but residents that actually live in these communities that aren't terrified that their economic plight will be absolutely devastated if they speak out. And I think so this is probably part of the plan or what needs to happen, and I don't think that we'll have environmental justice here until we start to figure that out. So I think that's all I have. Thank you. I appreciate it. Guess I have some time for questions. One question?
No, we have time for questions because we end at 5:30. Questions?
Yes.
I was wondering, thinking about the respondents who acknowledge the issue but defend DuPont, do you think the bigger reason would be more of the lack of other resources, kind of the fear of what will we do without them, or do you think it's kind of more on the lines of the overall sociology of Appalachia, kind of doing the same, very traditional, doing the same thing for many years, just kind of a little more guarded towards people kind of coming in?
I think it's probably both. I think that's a really good point. You know, I tend to always come at things from a political economy perspective, so I'm thinking, you know, there's a lack of, you know, economic opportunity, and people are going to be very guarded about what they have if there aren't a lot of prospects. And that's time and time again what our respondents on both sides of this issue said. And so I think that's a big part of it, but I think you're right, and that's where I'm not so much, right? I'm certainly not an expert on that, but what is the sort of larger ideology, the mentality, the cultural practices that are going on in this part of the world, right? We know that Appalachians have long had a lot of mistrust for the government for very good reason, right? A lot of mistrust of outsiders because oftentimes people come in and they do things that aren't very nice, so they exploit local populations in one way or another. So I think that that's probably a part of it as well. And so, you know, I'm not trying to say that this explanation is everything. I don't think it is. It's probably, you know, one way of looking at what's going on. And I just find it time and time again coming back, being really interested in why certain groups of people, politically speaking, acquiesce to major corporate transgressions, and then other people are, you know, in the streets marching, militant, laying down in front of trucks, you know, and so it has to be context specific as a geographer, right? We can't say this will work everywhere. This explains everything everywhere. So yeah, long answer to a very good question, and I didn't do a very good job answering it. Yeah.
How do you think that, like, you talked at the end about having to like bring other companies in or like other like reasons for people, like other places where people can be employed. How do you think that that's possible? Since especially because like I feel like other companies would look at it and be like, wow, like we're gonna inherit all this mess when we move in. Like it just seems like it would be very conducive to having people move in because they wouldn't want to.
Yeah. So great point, right? I'm a critical geographer. I'm really good at picking things apart and having criticisms, as some people in here already know. The solution is way more complicated. And I don't know. I'm not good at policy prescription. I'm good at I like to anyway, think I'm good at teasing apart political, economic relations, that kind of thing. I don't know. And the reason why I say this, I hate to be a defeatist, and I don't want to be that way, but at the same time, to me, this is part and parcel of a much larger neoliberalized, globalized political economy. And these people in Washington Works or Commuters Now, they know, right, that their jobs are now, they're in competition with people in China for this kind of employment. And so when you talk about major free trade, international free trade agreements, the precarity, I think, for people working in these kinds of industries is even greater now. That's my take on it. And I don't know what the fix or the solution is to that. How radical do you want to get? You know, in reality, we have to think about this at a scalar level. Sure, I'm I'm talking about something happening at a very local scale in Southeast Ohio and part of Western West Virginia. But in reality, this is linked to a much larger trend internationally. And so what is what is that when we have a resource poor area that few people seem to be paying attention to in government or elsewhere? How do we do that? That's, boy, if you could figure that out, maybe other people have good ideas.
What was the level of education of like the people you interviewed for everything? Obviously, you had like chemical engineers and people that worked at DuPont, but what else?
Right. Nobody that we actually interviewed actually currently worked at DuPont. No one who was working at DuPont was willing to talk to us. I should have said that. But there were family members that were still working at DuPont or people who worked in the past. Almost everyone had at least some education post-high school that we talked to with this. Actually, quite a few people had 4-year degrees. Yeah, I don't know if that helps. And we didn't really think about how that impacted people's responses. But that's an important consideration, right? Because a lot of the people living in this part of the world for a very long time could go right from high school right into a really good paying job in the company at some point or another. And I don't know how that's, maybe other people know how that's changed or if it's the same, but it's a great question. Yeah.
Have there been any efforts to develop a polymer that would replace C8?
Yes, so that's another great question. As I said, 3M phased this out a while ago, like maybe a couple of decades ago. But now DuPont had promised to phase it out by 2015, and it seems like they have done that from what I've read. I don't know that for sure. But supposedly they came up with another polymer, right, that is less persistent in the environment. But here's a question, right? This goes to chemical regulation in the United States more generally, right? The chemical industry is creating tens of thousands of compounds. I think there's something like 80,000 out there that we know of. How many of them have been tested for their safety, do you think? A couple hundred. And it's usually after they've been proven to cause harm in some other scientific study before the EPA will take note. So some of the people that we've talked to are like, whoa, well, so what's the next thing? And will that make it in there? What does that mean for us? We don't know, right? And I'll give the company the benefit of the doubt. Hopefully it's a better, safer product than what they used to use. But supposedly that's been phased out or is being phased out. It's being used elsewhere in the world. And this stuff persists forever. So it'll be around for a long time. Yeah.
So toward the end you were talking about the concerns about the regulations and all of that. Did you see any correlation with those comments and how people felt about whether it was environmental justice or not? If those who may be considered apologists also were blaming regulators for this thing that may not have happened.
Yeah, I think there was and I didn't mention it specifically, that's a great question. I think there was a sort of latent mistrust that sort of manifested itself occasionally for apologists that were like, the regulators interfere with business. They don't exactly know what the safe threshold of this is anyway, so why are we, making these drastic decisions and making this company pay a lot of money for something we don't know about? Certainly the people that viewed it as an injustice had a lot of mistrust for regulators. They had very little faith in regulators from that standpoint. So it's kind of interesting that most of the people we talked to didn't have a whole lot of faith in various EPA agencies or WVDEP as well, but for different reasons, seemingly. So, yeah. I don't know if that answers your question. Dr. Kim?
It's DuPont said that we are all in this together. It's like a car companies saying that you don't like this job, then those Chinese workers will love to take up your job. The car companies are saying this. So then it's very misleading, but nonetheless very skillful tactic to manipulate the workers, the community people, all this. So if that was the case, then let's say activists or liberal politicians or academics, we may have to develop countering narrative, some sort of simple talking points that they could have a nice link to these workers.
Absolutely, right? I mean, how do you blame people, right, for defending a company when it really is the biggest game in town, right? And it is so important to the plight of the economy of this little sub-region, right? So, obviously this is really contentious stuff, right? Not everyone agrees with everyone, and oftentimes from what our response were telling me, people got really angry with one another on occasion. And so what kind of narrative can you create to say, okay, I hear your side, but, right? I mean, to me, the arrangement, right, is just so ludicrous that you have to put up with being sick. And so how do you do that in a way that people actually listen and create dialogue? Because the stakes are really high, right? If you think about it, the stakes are super high here. It's go hungry or get potentially exposed to a chemical. What are the other options? So how do we, I don't know, how do we create that narrative? Maybe that's another good paper or a topic, yeah.
It'll be interesting if the name changes after they merge.
Yeah,
It's been a family and now it's
what's going on with that? And that's something, admittedly, I just have not been paying attention to, and I would like to do so. What does that mean, right? That's a really important sort of rhetoric or narrative to say, hey, we're all a part of this, and how do you sort of counter that? And then it is corporate America, right? It's constantly changing and spinning off and splitting up and going bankrupt. And so I think that some of the uncertainty that some of these people were mentioning before, like, what happens if this company goes away to the water, the money that is used to filter our water, right? They really were concerned about that, and I think that goes to that idea. What does a name change mean? What does this merger with Dow mean? And one of the activists that we talked to, I bring my students out to speak with her and look at this. She said that that name change and spinning this Washington Works plant off is probably a strategy. Now this is hearsay, this is what this person said, is a strategy to defend the larger corporation from the 3,500 individual lawsuits that are coming down the pipeline. So there's I think there's probably a lot of uncertainty. Are there questions?
All right, well, thank you very much.
Thank you. Applause for you all.